Have you ever watched a genuinely kind person completely change after a major betrayal? It is one of the most jarring things to witness because it doesn't happen with a loud explosion. They don't launch a revenge campaign, they don't throw tantrums, and they don't instantly turn into a cold, hateful monster. Instead, something incredibly deep inside their soul just breaks in absolute, devastating silence. There are no warning signs, no dramatic arguments, and no crying out for help. This quiet fracture marks the exact moment the emotional innocence of an empath dies. They finally realize that the purity they brought to the world is not matched by the people around them. This silence isn't a lack of feeling. It is the sound of a total internal collapse where the old version of them ceases to exist. The world severely misunderstands empaths, completely misinterpreting their natural kindness as weakness and their deep emotional intelligence as an endless hall pass for forgiveness. People look at an empath's capacity to understand, heal, and tolerate pain, and they mistakenly assume that this person can be drained forever without consequence. Toxic people treat an empath's heart like an infinite well, taking and taking, assuming there will always be more love to give. But what these facilitators of hurt completely fail to realize is that everyone has a breaking point. While an empath can endure emotional agony and carry burdens far longer than the average person, they are not invincible. Once that damage penetrates the outer layers and hits the absolute core of their soul, the transformation becomes permanent. You cannot undo that level of damage. You cannot patch up a soul that has been forced to fundamentally alter how it views human nature just to survive. An empath does not just walk away at the first sign of trouble or the moment a relationship gets difficult. In fact, they do the exact opposite. They stay far longer than they should, handing out endless second, third, and fourth chances. They remain fiercely, almost blindly loyal to people who haven't earned it, constantly making excuses for bad behavior and choosing to see potential over reality. Day after day, they quietly absorb the heavy emotional weight of the relationship, taking on the stress, the anxiety, and the moods of the other person while wearing a brave face and pretending everything is completely fine. When an empath chooses to love you, they do not do it halfway. They love with an absolute raw entirety that leaves them completely exposed. That is precisely why betrayal doesn't just disappoint them or make them angry, it completely destroys them. It shatters the entire foundation of how they experience reality. The destruction comes from the brutal, sickening realization that the very person they were actively protecting, defending, and pouring their energy into was the exact same person actively hurting them behind their back. It is the sudden, terrifying clarity that all of their loyalty, sacrifice, and deep care were entirely one-sided. They are forced to look at the undeniable truth that their pure intentions, their vulnerability, and their open-hearted honesty were not respected, but were instead weaponized against them and used as a blueprint to manipulate them. They realized they were sleeping next to an enemy while treating them like a sanctuary. When that truth finally lands and the illusion evaporates, the emotional shift inside the empath is swift, absolute, and utterly irreversible. The person who gave everything instantly realizes they have nothing left to give to someone who values nothing. When an empath is deeply betrayed, they do not explode. They don't throw tantrums, they don't scream at the top of their lungs, they don't start arguments, and they don't create loud, dramatic, chaotic scenes to get attention. Instead, they do something far more unpredictable. They go completely, utterly silent. This isn't a petty silent treatment or a temporary sulk. It is a total emotional shutdown. And that specific type of silence terrifies the people around them. Outsiders and betrayers expect a reaction. They expect tears, anger, defending, or fighting back, because that is how most people react when they are hurt. But when the empath drops all communication and removes their energy entirely, it creates an eerie, uncomfortable void. The empath completely retreats inward, locking themselves inside their own mind and cutting off the emotional supply they used to hand out so freely. Inside that quiet fortress, a chaotic storm is raging. The empath begins replaying the entire history of the betrayal over and over again, like a broken, horrific movie on an endless loop. Suddenly, every single past conversation they ever had with that person begins to feel incredibly suspicious. Every sweet word, every promise, and every shared memory instantly turns into a source of sharp, agonizing pain. Their mind begins to actively connect the dots that they previously chose to ignore. Every single red flag they brushed off, every gut feeling they suppressed, and every lie they excused out of love suddenly makes perfect, undeniable sense. They are forced to re-examine their entire reality through the lens of truth, and the clarity they find is blinding. They realize that while they were operating with pure sincerity, they were being actively played. This sudden awakening triggers a dangerous, toxic internal war of intense self-blame. Instead of directing all their anger outward at the person who maliciously hurt them, the empath turns that destructive energy inward on themselves. They begin to torture their own mind with agonizing, unanswerable questions on a daily basis. They ask themselves, how on earth did I miss this? Why was I so incredibly blind? Why did I give my sacred trust to someone so careless? Was absolutely any of it real? Or was my entire life just a lie? They begin to carry a heavy, suffocating mountain of guilt, not for what was done to them, but for the fact that they willingly invested their precious time, love, and energy into someone who never deserved a single drop of it. They feel foolish for believing in a fraud. While the outside world keeps spinning and everyone around them moves on with their normal days, the empath is stuck fighting a desperate, invisible battle for basic emotional survival inside the confines of their own mind, completely disconnected from the world around them. Betrayal does not just break an empath's heart, it fundamentally attacks and shatters their core identity. For an empath, looking for the good in people isn't just a choice, it is exactly who they are. They are wired to search for the hidden light in everyone they meet, naturally looking past flaws and actively finding deep excuses for bad behavior instead of judging it. When someone hurts them, the empath's immediate instinct is to look for the trauma, the stress, or the misunderstanding that caused it. They rewrite other people's malice into pain that needs healing. But a deep, calculated betrayal destroys this mechanism entirely. It forces them to look a brutal, undeniable reality dead in the eyes. Not everyone has a pure heart like theirs. They are forced to accept that some people are entirely comfortable with manipulating, lying, and destroying a good person for their own selfish gain. This singular realization completely changes their entire psychological operating system. It rewires the way they think, feel, and process human connections forever. Once this shift happens, the empath stops listening to words entirely and starts strictly, relentlessly watching actions. They lose their appetite for beautiful promises, sweet apologies, and grand declarations of love because they have learned the hard way that words cost absolutely nothing. They realize that poetry can be used to mask poison. The naive, childlike innocence that made them believe everyone operated with the same sincerity they did vanishes into thin air. The person who once granted unlimited emotional access to almost anyone who asked for it suddenly shuts the gates and builds an unshakable, heavily guarded fortress around their soul. They stop volunteering their vulnerability, they stop oversharing their inner world, and they stop allowing people to rent space in their hearts for free. They become highly selective, deeply private, and fiercely protective of their remaining peace. When the people around them notice this sudden, drastic boundary, they almost always complain. They look at the newly guarded empath and say, "You've changed," or accuse them of becoming cold, distant, and uncaring. But these critics are incredibly hypocritical. because they never look at what actually caused the fracture in the first place. They blame the empath for building a wall, but they completely ignore the emotional sledgehammers they used to force that wall to go up. They miss the benefits of the empath's old, boundaryless self, so they label the growth as a flaw. The truth is, betrayal forces the empath to finally learn a life-saving lesson that changes their destiny. Endless forgiveness without change is not kindness. It is not spiritual. It is not noble, and it is not love. It is pure, unadulterated self-destruction. They realize that by continuously absorbing disrespect just to keep a relationship alive, they were actively participating in their own abuse. This identity shift marks the day they finally decide to stop destroying themselves just to keep ungrateful people comfortable. The very first major shift that occurs after an empath heals from betrayal is complete emotional detachment. This sudden transformation sends absolute shockwaves through their entire social circle, leaving everyone completely stunned. People are used to the empath's natural warmth, their endless comfort, and the deep, undivided attention they always bring to the table. For years, people ran to the empath to dump their problems, find validation, and feel emotionally safe. But betrayal acts as a harsh, cold awakening. It teaches the empath a vital truth. Their emotional energy is not a free, limitless resource. It is a premium, high-value currency. Once they realize this, they stop handing it out for free to anyone with a sad story. Their entire demeanor shifts. Conversations instantly get shorter, texts become concise, and their presence becomes highly selective. They completely stop chasing after people who distance themselves. They stop over-explaining their intentions to people who choose to misunderstand them. And they absolutely refuse to beg anyone to care about them ever again. This exact moment of sudden detachment is when the manipulators and toxic people in their life enter a state of pure, unadulterated panic. Toxic individuals do not know how to handle an empath who has gone cold because their entire survival strategy relies on the empath remaining emotionally vulnerable, highly available, and easily manipulated by guilt. They depend on the empath's natural desire to fix things and smooth over conflict. The very second that emotional connection is cut and the empath pulls their energy back behind the fortress walls, the manipulator instantly loses all of their power and control. They can no longer trigger the empath's empathy. They can no longer weaponize guilt, and they can no longer twist reality. Suddenly, a bizarre and highly predictable dynamic takes place. The exact same people who took the empath for granted, ignored their needs, and treated them like an option start frantically chasing after them. They bombard them with messages, check in on them, and try every trick in the book to re-engage. But they aren't chasing the empath because they genuinely love them or feel sorry for hurting them. They are chasing them because they are in deep withdrawal. They desperately miss the massive emotional benefits, the unconditional attention, the constant validation, and the steady emotional baseline they used to freely extract and abuse. They miss having a personal emotional garbage can to dump their chaos into, and they are terrified of a reality where they actually have to sit with their own toxic behavior alone. Once the dust settles and the initial trauma begins to recede, the empath's emotional vision undergoes a radical transformation. It becomes incredibly, almost painfully sharp. Before the betrayal, their vision was clouded by a desire to see the best in everyone, often ignoring the warning signs that were right in front of their faces. But now, they possess a refined, high-definition radar for deceit. They can see straight through the thin veil of fake apologies, which are usually designed to bypass accountability rather than offer genuine remorse. They can immediately spot the patterns of selective loyalty, where a person only shows up when they need something or when it is convenient for them. They have become masters at identifying manipulation disguised as love, recognizing when caring is actually just a mask for control or emotional extraction. This change represents a fundamental shift in how they apply their greatest gift. Before betrayal, they spent their entire lives using their empathy as a weapon to heal others, often pouring from an empty cup and neglecting their own wounds. Now they flip the script. They use that same profound intuition to protect themselves. This is a massive, permanent shift in their personality and their priorities. They no longer look at empathy as an obligation to save everyone who crosses their path. They treat it as a sacred resource that must be guarded. This is not a temporary phase or a bad mood. It is the permanent installation of a new boundary system that filters out toxic influences before they can ever get close enough to inflict damage again. The empath stops making the mistakes that once cost them their sanity. They stop ignoring that nagging feeling in their gut that tells them something is wrong. And they stop defending people who show them disrespect. They stop sacrificing their precious mental peace just to keep a shaky relationship on life support. To the outside world, this might look like the empath has become cruel, bitter, or changed. But that interpretation is completely wrong. They are not becoming cruel. They are simply becoming aware. They are waking up to the reality that they were previously enabling their own mistreatment. Crucially, they still know how to love. They haven't lost their capacity for deep connection, and they haven't closed their hearts off from the world. However, they have finally established a non-negotiable hierarchy. Boundaries must come first. They have reached a hard-won realization that love without respect is nothing more than emotional slavery. They understand now that if they have to shrink themselves, silence their needs, or tolerate disrespect to keep someone's love, it was never love in the first place. It was a transaction where they were the only one paying the bill. Now, they only offer their love to those who treat their boundaries as a bridge, not a hurdle. True healing does not start when the raw pain finally stops burning. It doesn't start when the betrayer undergoes a sudden change of heart and offers a massive apology. And it definitely does not start when some perfect version of closure magically lands on your doorstep. If you wait for the person who broke you to fix you, you will be waiting forever. Real, life-changing healing begins at one exact, powerful moment. The precise second the empath stops blaming themselves for the damage that was done to them. Betrayal is a psychological weapon that completely warps reality. It thrives on convincing good, pure-hearted people that they were somehow the cause of their own destruction. It implants a toxic narrative in the empath's mind, making them believe they were either too much or not enough, too sensitive, too trusting, too loud, too emotional, or not smart enough to see the lies. The empath will spend months agonizing over what they could have done differently to change the outcome. But eventually, the fog lifts and the absolute truth settles deep into their soul. Their kindness, their open heart, and their willingness to love were never the problem. There is nothing wrong with being a person who operates with purity and integrity. The real, undeniable problem was giving fierce, unyielding loyalty to a person who was fundamentally incapable of valuing it. The flaw was never in the empath's capacity to love. The flaw was in the betrayer's inability to be honest. With that monumental realization, an incredible transformation takes place. The empath becomes quiet, steady, and completely unshakable. They experience a profound internal grounding that doesn't need to be loud or boastful to prove its existence. They completely stop fighting for validation from people who are blind to their worth. They stop auditioning for a place in the lives of individuals who treat them like a convenient backup plan or a temporary option. They stop trying to convince people to love them, respect them, or see their value. They drop the need to win arguments or get the last word. Instead, they turn all that wasted energy inward, and absolute peace becomes their new, non-negotiable priority. If a person, a job, or environment threatens that peace, the empath quietly and smoothly removes themselves from the equation without a single explanation. A fully healed empath becomes a terrifying force for toxic people because they are nearly impossible to manipulate. Why? Because they have completely lost the fear of losing people. That specific, paralyzing fear of abandonment and conflict used to be the exact remote control that manipulators used to dominate the empath's life. It was the fear that forced them to silence their own voice, walk on eggshells, swallow their anger, and tolerate blatant disrespect just to keep a relationship alive or avoid making waves. They used to value the presence of others far more than they valued their own comfort. But betrayal is a brutal teacher that delivers a profound, life-altering lesson. Losing a relationship is a minor inconvenience compared to the absolute horror of losing yourself. They look back at the wreckage of their past and realize that the worst thing that ever happened to them wasn't the betrayer walking away. It was the fact that they abandoned their own soul to keep a toxic person happy. Once you survive that level of self-loss and successfully rebuild your spirit from scratch, you realize that you are completely capable of surviving anyone's absence. This radical shift in perspective changes how they make choices every single day. They now aggressively choose raw honesty over comfortable attachment, and they choose rigid boundaries over cheap, fleeting approval. They would much rather stand completely alone in the truth than sit in a room full of people wearing a mask just to fit in. Because of this, the people who used to benefit from their endless patience, their boundaryless kindness, and their infinite second chances suddenly cannot recognize them anymore. The old, easy-to-use version of the empath is completely dead and buried. The healed empath has finally mastered the most powerful word in the human language: no. They say it clearly, directly, and without a single shred of guilt. They say no to disrespect in tone and action. They say no to subtle emotional manipulation and guilt trips. They say no to fake conditional loyalty that only shows up when it's convenient. And they say a permanent no to soul-draining connections that demand everything and give nothing in return. They become entirely untouchable to those who wish to use them, because the moment a manipulator tries to cross the line, the empath simply walks away without looking back. When an empath is forced to experience betrayal repeatedly, they do not just get sad, down, or temporarily depressed. Ordinary sadness is something you can recover from with a bit of time and rest. But what happens to a repeatedly betrayed empath goes infinitely deeper. They experience profound soul fatigue. This is a heavy, bone-deep exhaustion where your very spirit feels entirely drained of life. They get tired of carrying emotional burdens that were never theirs to bear in the first place. They get tired of constantly over-explaining their pure intentions to people who are fully committed to misunderstanding them. They get deeply, completely exhausted from only ever being appreciated, valued, and missed after they have finally packed their bags and gone. During this heavy phase, the empath undergoes a major internal shift. They emotionally disappear. They don't necessarily pack up and leave physically, but they completely stop sharing their sacred inner world. They lock away their thoughts, their deep feelings, and their vulnerability, pulling their energy back entirely from the people around them. The people who used to have free, unhindered access to the empath's energy almost always mistake this sudden emotional withdrawal for cold arrogance, pride, or a lack of care. But the truth behind their silence is much deeper and entirely direct. It is pure, unadulterated survival. The empath has finally woken up to the fact that some people are emotional vampires who only approach them to extract healing, comfort, and free therapy. These individuals show up like clockwork during their own personal crises, taking every single drop of support, loyalty, and understanding the empath has to offer, but they disappear the exact second the empath needs a shoulder to lean on. They give absolutely nothing meaningful in return. Once the empath develops this sharpened, razor-sharp awareness, they begin to notice the massive imbalances in their relationships immediately. They notice who only texts them when they need a favor. They notice the one-sided conversations where the other person talks about themselves for hours. And they notice who vanishes when life gets heavy. Because of this newfound clarity, the empath ruthlessly shrinks their social circle down to almost nothing. While this shrinking can feel incredibly lonely at first, it actually acts as a brilliant natural filter. It creates an environment that automatically keeps the users, the takers, and the toxic manipulators completely out, while leaving open, safe spaces for genuine, mature, and deeply respectful connections to flow in. Ultimately, the deeply betrayed empath reaches a profound milestone in their healing journey. They completely stop trying to be understood by everyone, and that shift brings absolute, breathtaking freedom. Before they achieve this level of growth, they spent a massive amount of their life wasting precious energy overanalyzing every single conversation, proving their good intentions to skeptics, and living in constant fear of disappointing people. But after surviving the fire of betrayal, they realize a liberating truth that changes everything. People who genuinely value you, love you, and deserve a place in your life will never force you to beg for your worth. They will never make you audition for their respect or prove that you are a good person. The moment the empath fully internalizes this, the crushing emotional pressure of trying to please the world completely evaporates. They transform into a person who is significantly calmer, highly private, and quietly observant. They move through life differently, choosing to listen more and speak less, protecting their energy like the rare asset it is. When their old, toxic relationships naturally begin to collapse and fall apart, simply because the empath is no longer easy to guilt trip, use, or control, the critics and takers in their life will loudly lash out. They will claim the empath has become cold, distant, selfish, or unfeeling. But the reality behind this dynamic is beautifully and powerfully simple. The empath did not become a bad person. They just completely stopped accepting mistreatment. They drew a line in the sand and refused to let people cross it. This brutal process of betrayal and recovery introduces the empath to an entirely new version of themselves, wrapped in a quiet, arrogant-free confidence. This isn't a loud, boastful confidence that needs to show off or put others down to feel big. It is a steady, unshakable, internal knowing that requires absolutely zero outside validation. They still possess a massive capacity to love deeply and show real empathy to the world, but now they protect their own peace just as fiercely as they care for others. They are no longer a target for manipulation. And here is the final, most brutal and agonizing part of the entire journey for the person who betrayed them. The empath eventually stops caring at all. They don't hate the betrayer, they don't wish bad things upon them, and they don't look for revenge. They just reach a state of complete, pure indifference. The betrayer becomes nothing more than a stranger with a familiar face, completely erased from the empath's heart, leaving the person who hurt them to live with the permanent, haunting memory of the pure soul they foolishly threw away.